I'll tell you the exact moment I realized my neighbor wasn't trying to annoy me anymore. She was trying to erase me. The first thing I noticed wasn't the fence. It was the silence. My diesel pickup rolled off the county road just after sunrise, gravel crunching beneath the tires as the smell of damp pine and fresh-cut grass drifted through the open window. I'd spent 5 straight days overseeing a commercial concrete pour nearly 300 miles away, surviving on gas station coffee and 4 hours of sleep each night. All I wanted was to back my truck into my garage, shower, and forget the world existed for a weekend. Instead, my headlights stopped on 8-foot sections of brand-new black steel fencing stretched across the entrance to my driveway like they had always belonged there. Fresh concrete still surrounded every fence post, pale gray against the darker soil, telling me the installation couldn't have been more than 24 hours old. I shut off the engine, and suddenly the neighborhood felt unnaturally quiet. No lawnmowers, no barking dogs, just the faint metallic rattle of a loose chain swaying in the morning breeze. I stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the soft shoulder beside the road, and ran my hand across the cold steel. The concrete around the posts was still curing. Whoever built this hadn't just blocked my driveway. They'd planned it carefully enough to make removal expensive. Then I heard slow applause behind me. "Welcome home, Ethan," a woman's voice called with the kind of smile you could hear before you ever saw it. I turned toward the house next door, and there she was. Brenda Collins. White linen pants. Designer sunglasses. A travel mug balanced effortlessly in one hand, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. She leaned against her porch railing like someone watching the final scene of a movie she'd already memorized. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever come back," she said. I looked from her to the fence and back again. "Why is there a fence across my driveway?" She shrugged with theatrical innocence. "According to the HOA's updated Community Boundary Review, that access belongs to shared association property now." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was too ridiculous to process any other way. My father had poured that driveway himself 31 years earlier. I knew exactly where every expansion joint ran beneath those tires. I had helped him finish the edges with a steel trowel when I was barely tall enough to see over the forms. There wasn't a surveyor in the state who could convince me that driveway belonged to anyone else. Brenda lifted her coffee cup and took a slow sip. "You blue-collar types always think owning a deed means you own everything around it." The smell of wet concrete drifted through the air, mixing with fresh mulch from someone's flower beds, and something about that scent made my stomach tighten. I knew concrete better than most people know their own handwriting. Every pour leaves a story. Every measurement leaves evidence. Every shortcut leaves a scar. Whoever installed this fence hadn't expected the homeowner to spend his life building retaining walls, foundations, municipal sidewalks, and commercial structures across 3 states. They saw a contractor's truck and assumed they were dealing with another guy who'd yell, threaten a lawsuit, and eventually give up. Brenda smiled wider when I didn't answer immediately. Across the street, curtains shifted. A garage door opened halfway before stopping. Neighbors were watching without pretending otherwise. They wanted to see whether I'd explode. Instead, I walked the entire length of the fence one slow step at a time, counting every panel, every post, every anchor bolt, every inch of setback from the pavement. Brenda frowned slightly. That wasn't the reaction she'd prepared for. "Planning to climb over it?" she asked. I smiled for the first time that morning. "No." I brushed a little curing dust off one of the posts and looked directly at her. "I'm measuring." Her smile disappeared for less than a second before returning. Most people would never have noticed it. I did. Because that's the exact moment she realized something she hadn't considered before she poured those footings. She thought she'd trapped my truck. What she didn't know was that she'd just revealed the only legal path in and out of her own garage. And before another week was over, that tiny detail would become the most expensive mistake she'd ever make. I have spent my entire adult life believing that concrete tells the truth. It does not care about opinions, neighborhood politics, or expensive titles printed on business cards. If the forms are crooked, the wall ends up crooked. If the measurements are wrong, everyone can see it forever. Maybe that is why I chose this trade. My father used to tell me that honest work leaves honest evidence, and standing there with my boots on the same driveway he had poured decades earlier, I could almost hear his voice over the soft breeze moving through the oak trees. He bought this property when I was 10 years old, back when Willow Creek Estates was little more than open fields and a handful of construction trailers. Most people hired contractors to build their dream homes. My father became the contractor. Every Saturday morning smelled like wet lumber, diesel fuel, and fresh concrete. I learned how to stretch a tape measure before I learned long division. By the time I graduated high school, I could read blueprints almost as easily as a newspaper. After college, I skipped the office jobs my classmates chased and went straight back to construction. 20 years later, Walker Concrete Solutions had earned a reputation across 3 counties for doing projects the right way. Parking lots, retaining walls, sidewalks, foundations, municipal repairs, and commercial developments. I had poured concrete for schools, fire stations, libraries, and hospitals. Every inspector who worked with me knew one thing about Ethan Walker. If my name was on the permit, the measurements would match the plans. That reputation mattered more to me than any fancy truck or oversized house ever could. The garage behind me was more than a place to park my equipment. It was my workshop, my office, and the place where my father and I had rebuilt his old pickup before cancer took him 8 years ago. I never changed the wooden workbench he built with his own hands. His old level still hung on the wall beside the cabinet. His faded pencil marks were still visible along one shelf where he measured lumber for our first backyard deck. Every inch of this property carried memories that could never appear on a deed, but the deed existed all the same. Locked inside a fireproof safe sat the original survey, title insurance documents, engineering drawings, county approvals, and every permit issued since the house was built. My father believed paperwork deserved the same respect as concrete because both became impossible to argue with when they were done correctly. Brenda Collins believed something entirely different. She had lived next door for only 4 years, but she acted as though the neighborhood had elected royalty instead of a volunteer board member. Before becoming the vice president of the Homeowners Association, she had worked as a real estate broker, and she carried herself with polished confidence that impressed people who only looked at appearances. Fresh landscaping appeared at her house every season. Holiday decorations arrived before anyone else had even opened their storage bins. She knew every family by name, every committee member by preference, and every neighborhood rumor before breakfast. Most people thought she was simply organized. I noticed something else. She liked controlling conversations more than solving problems. It started with little things after I moved back into my parents' home full-time following my father's passing. She complained that my work trailer looked too commercial even though the community rules allowed temporary parking. She questioned whether my stack of retaining wall blocks beside the garage counted as construction debris despite being neatly organized for a project beginning the following Monday. One month she reported my pickup because it collected dust after a week of rain. Another month she insisted the security lights over my driveway were too bright even though they pointed straight downward and met every county lighting ordinance. None of those complaints ever resulted in violations because every single one failed inspection. Eventually, I realized something important. Brenda was not trying to enforce standards. She was testing boundaries. Every failed complaint taught her a little more about how patient I was. Every polite response convinced her that I preferred avoiding conflict. She mistook professionalism for weakness. She saw a contractor who solved problems instead of creating scenes and assumed she could keep pushing until something finally broke. Standing beside that newly installed fence, breathing in the unmistakable scent of curing concrete, I realized she had finally pushed beyond neighborhood politics and stepped directly onto ground where measurements, property lines, permits, and recorded documents mattered far more than popularity. And unlike opinions shared at monthly association meetings, those things could not be voted into becoming something they were never designed to be. I did not call a lawyer first. I did not call the Homeowners Association office either. I called the county records department before most people had finished breakfast. Years in construction had taught me one simple rule. Never argue about land until you know exactly what the documents say. The woman who answered the phone recognized my company name immediately because we had completed several municipal projects together over the years. She could not discuss legal conclusions, but she confirmed something important. No recorded amendment had changed the boundary lines for my lot. No new plat had been filed. No public easement had been granted. No subdivision revision had been approved. That meant whatever Brenda believed she had accomplished did not exist inside the official county records. When I thanked her and hung up, I looked across the fence again. Brenda was already outside, chatting with two members of the Homeowners Association board as though they were celebrating a successful community improvement project. They laughed together while occasionally glancing in my direction. It was the kind of performance designed to convince everyone else that the matter had already been settled. Around noon, an envelope appeared inside my mailbox with the association logo printed neatly across the front. Inside was a formal notice stating that my driveway access had allegedly violated updated community circulation standards and that temporary barriers had been installed pending compliance. The wording sounded impressive until I noticed what it carefully avoided saying. It never claimed ownership had changed. It never cited a county ordinance. It never referenced a recorded survey. Instead, it relied on vague phrases like community interest, safety improvements, and board authority. Those words might sound convincing during monthly meetings, but they carried very little weight against property records. Even so, I understood exactly why Brenda wrote the letter that way. Most homeowners never read their deeds after closing day. Most people assumed the association understood the rules better than they did. Fear and confidence often looked identical when wrapped inside official letterhead. By late afternoon, several neighbors wandered over one at a time, each pretending to check the mail or walk a dog while quietly asking what had happened. Some genuinely seemed concerned. Others clearly wanted the latest neighborhood drama. One older gentleman shook his head and whispered that Brenda had been telling everyone the driveway had always crossed association property and that she finally convinced the board to correct the mistake. I thanked him for the information without correcting him. Rumors travel faster than facts, but they usually collapse the moment evidence appears. Brenda must have noticed how calm I remained because she crossed the street before sunset carrying another travel mug. "I hope you are making arrangements for another parking spot," she said. "These reviews can take months." I leaned against my truck and smiled politely. "Interesting." She folded her arms. "You do understand the association can enforce community standards." "Of course," I answered, "within the limits of its authority." Her expression hardened slightly. "You should really think about cooperating instead of making this difficult." I almost laughed because I had heard similar sentences before. Developers said them when inspectors rejected shortcuts. Suppliers said them when materials failed specifications. People who expected others to surrender often confused cooperation with agreement. I simply nodded and wished her a pleasant evening. That seemed to frustrate her more than any argument could have. The following morning, I visited the property from the opposite side of the fence carrying nothing except a clipboard, a tape measure, and a notebook. I measured visible distances from permanent landmarks without stepping onto her side or disturbing a single post. Every number went into neat columns. Every observation included the time and weather conditions. A young couple walking their dog slowed down long enough to watch. One of them asked whether I planned to tear the fence down. "No," I replied. "Not today." They looked confused because they expected anger, not measurements. That afternoon, another association notice arrived threatening daily fines if I attempted to remove or bypass the barrier. I filed it beside the first letter without responding. Paperwork has a strange habit of becoming evidence when people write more than they should. By the third day, Brenda appeared almost disappointed that I had not raised my voice, contacted the local news, or started a public argument online. Instead, she watched me continue documenting everything with quiet precision. She believed silence meant surrender. She never considered that silence can also mean someone is gathering every piece of the puzzle before placing the final one exactly where it belongs. On the fourth morning, I decided it was time to stop making assumptions and start collecting independent facts. I hired a licensed land surveyor who had worked with my company on several commercial developments over the years. He was the kind of professional who trusted measurements more than conversations, which was exactly what I needed. His crew arrived in a white truck carrying tripods, survey rods, bright orange marking flags, and equipment that looked more like something from a space program than a construction site. As they unloaded everything, several neighbors drifted outside again, pretending to water flowers or check their mail while quietly watching every move. Brenda stepped onto her front porch with a satisfied smile that suggested she believed the survey would confirm everything she had been telling the neighborhood. She even waved cheerfully at the crew as if they were there to validate her authority. The surveyor introduced himself, reviewed the recorded plat, and explained that the process would rely entirely on county records, permanent monuments, and physical measurements rather than association documents. Brenda interrupted before he could finish. She announced that the Homeowners Association had already completed its own review and that the matter had been resolved. The surveyor politely thanked her for the information and continued setting up his equipment without changing a single step of his process. Watching him work reminded me why I respected skilled professionals. Confidence did not come from speaking loudly. It came from following procedures that could withstand scrutiny. For several hours they measured angles, verified benchmarks, located original boundary markers, and compared field observations with recorded documents. Every flag they placed seemed to attract another curious neighbor. The quiet hum of electronic equipment mixed with the distant sound of lawn sprinklers, while the smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the warm afternoon air. Brenda became noticeably less comfortable each time another orange flag appeared somewhere she had not expected. By late afternoon, the surveyor asked if we could speak privately near my truck. He spread several preliminary sketches across the tailgate and traced one finger along the recorded property line. The fence did not simply cross my driveway. Several posts had been installed inside my property boundary. The concrete footings themselves occupied land described on my deed. He emphasized that the official sealed survey would be completed after additional documentation and quality review, but his preliminary findings were remarkably consistent with the original county plat. I thanked him and scheduled the final report. Brenda watched our conversation from across the street without approaching. She could not hear the words, but she clearly noticed that neither of us looked surprised. That evening I contacted the non-emergency police number, not because I expected officers to solve a property dispute, but because I wanted documentation that access to my garage had been obstructed. The responding officer listened patiently, reviewed the situation, examined the fence, and explained exactly what I already expected. Ownership questions involving boundary lines required civil resolution rather than immediate enforcement unless there was an emergency or criminal activity. He documented the visit, gave me the incident number, and wished me luck. Some people would have considered that disappointing. I considered it another useful piece of the record. The following day, I visited the county planning office carrying copies of my deed, photographs, and the surveyor's preliminary observations. The staff explained permit procedures, setback requirements, and local construction regulations with impressive clarity. No one promised outcomes. No one took sides. They simply described the legal framework that governed permanent structures along private property lines. As I left the building carrying several application forms, I realized something important. Every official I had spoken with focused on documented facts instead of neighborhood opinions. Meanwhile, Brenda appeared to be relying entirely on confidence and assumptions. That afternoon, she walked across the street again, this time holding another envelope with the association logo. She informed me that additional daily fines would begin immediately because I had failed to comply with board directives. I accepted the envelope without opening it and thanked her. She looked almost disappointed that I refused to argue. "You still think this will end your way?" she asked. I smiled. "I think it will end exactly where the measurements say it should." She shook her head and returned home. As the sun settled lower behind the trees, I stood quietly beside the driveway that my father had built decades earlier. Bright orange survey flags fluttered gently in the breeze, almost unnoticed by everyone except the people who understood what they represented. To most of the neighborhood, they looked like small pieces of plastic. To me, they marked the beginning of something much bigger, because once the final survey arrived, opinions would no longer matter nearly as much as inches. 3 days later, the completed survey arrived inside a heavy mailing tube that felt far more important than its weight suggested. I carried it into my workshop, laid it across the same workbench my father had built, and carefully rolled the pages open beneath the old brass desk lamp. Fresh black lines crossed crisp white paper with the kind of precision that only licensed professionals could produce. Every monument, every bearing, every boundary, every improvement had been verified against county records. I followed the property line with my finger until I reached the driveway, exactly where I expected it to be. Then I continued farther toward Brenda's garage, and that was when one small detail changed everything. A narrow strip of land, only several feet wide, ran alongside the edge of my property before reaching the side of her garage. Most people would have ignored it because it looked insignificant on paper. I knew better. In construction, Small measurements often determine whether an entire project succeeds or fails. I pulled out older documents from my father's files, including the original subdivision plat, utility easement records, and a faded engineering drawing folded neatly inside a protective sleeve. For nearly an hour, I compared dimensions, dates, and reference numbers until every piece aligned perfectly. The original design of the neighborhood had placed Brenda's garage unusually close to the shared boundary because the developer wanted larger backyards. The only practical vehicle path leading into and out of that garage depended on clear access beside my property line. It had worked for decades because nobody had ever attempted to block or redefine the space. Brenda had spent years assuming convenience was the same thing as ownership. Then she built her fence without understanding the geometry surrounding her own house. I walked outside carrying the survey and quietly observed the neighborhood from the edge of my lawn. From where I stood, I could clearly see her driveway curving toward the garage. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. Then I imagined a permanent structure built entirely within my legal property boundary and exactly following every required setback. The picture formed almost instantly in my mind because I had designed retaining walls and access barriers for commercial sites my entire career. My pulse did not race. I did not feel excitement or anger. I simply recognized a possibility supported by measurements instead of emotion. Before acting on anything, I called the surveyor and asked one very specific question. He listened carefully before answering that any permanent construction would still need to satisfy local building regulations, permit requirements, and zoning restrictions regardless of property ownership. That was exactly the answer I wanted. Possibility alone was never enough. Everything had to be legal. Next, I scheduled a consultation with a local land use attorney recommended by one of my commercial clients. I spread every document across the conference table while he reviewed the survey, county records, association letters, photographs, and timeline I had assembled over the previous week. He read quietly for nearly 20 minutes before finally looking up with a slight smile. "You have been very organized," he said. "That usually helps." He explained that the homeowners association could adopt rules affecting appearance and maintenance within the limits of governing documents, but it could not simply relocate recorded property boundaries through internal votes. He also confirmed that property owners generally retain the right to improve their own land, so long as they complied with applicable laws and permit requirements. He stopped short of recommending any specific construction because those decisions depended on engineering and local approvals. But his conclusion reinforced everything I had suspected. Facts were steadily replacing assumptions. As I drove home that afternoon, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had every day before. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Someone washed a pickup truck in a driveway across the street. Wind pushed tree branches gently across the bright summer sky. Brenda waved confidently from her porch as though she believed time itself favored her position. I returned the wave without stopping. She interpreted calm as surrender because she still measured victory by appearances. She had no idea I now understood something she did not. The fence she proudly installed had not trapped me inside a legal corner. It had exposed a design flaw hidden in plain sight since the neighborhood was first built. Every survey flag, every recorded measurement, every old engineering drawing, and every conversation with professionals pointed toward the same conclusion. The smallest strip of land on the entire property had quietly become the most valuable piece of the puzzle, and before I touched a single bag of concrete or submitted a single permit application, I intended to make certain every inch of what happened next rested on the strongest foundation possible. I have always believed that the most dangerous moment in any construction project comes before the first shovel ever touches the ground. That is where expensive mistakes are either prevented or guaranteed. Over the next several days, my routine became almost boring to anyone watching from outside, which was exactly how I wanted it. Every morning, I left home carrying a folder instead of a toolbox. One stop was the county planning office. The next was the building department. Then I met with an engineer to review setback requirements, drainage considerations, and local code provisions for permanent masonry structures. Every answer I received led to another question, and I welcomed every one of them because each signature placed on an application removed another opportunity for anyone to challenge what would eventually happen. I refused to rely on assumptions when written approval could eliminate uncertainty. The permit technician recognized my company from previous commercial projects and carefully reviewed the proposed location against the official survey. We discussed height limitations, foundation depth, reinforcement schedules, inspection requirements, and property setbacks. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was improvised. When she finally stamped the application as approved, the sound of that rubber seal striking the paper was somehow more satisfying than any argument I could have won. I folded the permit into my folder with the same care my father used whenever he stored original blueprints. Back at home, I drove small wooden stakes into the ground exactly where the survey required, tying bright mason's string tightly between them until perfectly straight lines stretched across the narrow strip beside the property boundary. I measured every distance twice before writing each number into my notebook. Then I measured everything again the next morning. Experience had taught me that accuracy is rarely dramatic, but it is often unforgettable. Brenda noticed the stakes almost immediately. She walked to the edge of the fence with folded arms and watched me adjust one string line by less than half an inch. "Planning another project?" she asked with a smile that sounded more curious than confident. "Just following the survey," I replied without looking up. She laughed softly. "You contractors really do love your measurements." "Only because measurements remember things that people forget," I answered. She shook her head as though I had missed the point entirely. I suspected she believed I was preparing evidence for a lawsuit that would drag on for months. She never asked about permits. She never asked about inspections. She never imagined that every line I stretched across the grass represented a future structure already moving steadily through the legal process. The following afternoon, a white pickup from the utility locating service rolled into the neighborhood. Bright paint marks appeared across sections of grass, identifying underground lines exactly as required before excavation. Several neighbors wandered over to ask whether I was installing irrigation or replacing drainage pipes. I smiled politely and said only that I was preparing for an approved improvement on my property. The answers were truthful without revealing more than necessary. Brenda stood on her porch watching every spray-painted mark appear in the grass. I noticed something different in her expression. For the first time since the fence appeared, she looked uncertain instead of amused. 2 days later, the city inspector arrived for the required pre-construction review. We walked the proposed alignment together while comparing the permit drawings with the survey monuments. He checked setbacks, confirmed reference points, and reminded me about inspection stages before concrete placement. When he finished, he signed the inspection record and wished me luck with the project. Brenda stepped outside before his truck had even reached the end of the street. "Everything approved?" she called across the fence. "So far," I answered. "Good," she replied with a smile that looked carefully rehearsed. "I am sure whatever little project you are planning will stay well away from association property." I nodded politely because correcting her at that moment would have accomplished nothing. Confidence built on incomplete information often defeats itself without any assistance. That evening, I sat alone in my workshop surrounded by rolled plans, permits, survey maps, inspection notes, and engineering specifications spread neatly across the old wooden bench. The room smelled faintly of sawdust, machine oil, and the leather cover of my father's worn measuring tape. I rested one hand on the permit folder and realized I had not raised my voice once since returning home. I had not threatened anyone, ignored any regulation, or stepped outside a single legal requirement. While Brenda continued believing the neighborhood dispute revolved around personalities and authority, I had quietly transformed it into something much more powerful. From that point forward, the outcome would depend on recorded boundaries, approved drawings, inspection reports, and exact measurements. Those things never cared who smiled the loudest at a homeowners association meeting, and soon the entire neighborhood was going to learn the difference. I arrived before sunrise on Monday because concrete rewards preparation long before it rewards hard work. The air carried that cool morning smell that disappears within an hour after daylight, and a thin layer of dew still covered the grass beside the survey stakes. My crew rolled in one truck at a time, each driver already knowing the plan because we had reviewed every drawing the previous afternoon. There was no shouting, no confusion, and no surprises. We unloaded string lines, reinforcing steel, lumber for forms, compactors, and finishing tools with the same quiet rhythm we used on municipal projects. To everyone watching from across the street, it probably looked like another ordinary construction job. In many ways, That was exactly what it was. The difference was that every inch of this project had already been measured, approved, inspected, and documented before the first shovel entered the ground. I walked the layout one final time with the permit in one hand and the sealed survey in the other. Every stake matched the approved drawing. Every setback satisfied local code. Every corner aligned with the recorded property line. Only then did I give the signal to begin. The first sound was the steady hum of the compact excavator trimming the narrow foundation trench. Fresh soil released the familiar earthy scent that always reminded me of the first projects my father and I completed together decades earlier. Steel reinforcement followed, tied carefully into place before wooden forms created perfectly straight lines stretching beside the boundary. A few neighbors gathered quietly across the street with coffee cups in their hands, whispering to one another as they watched the work progress. Nobody seemed completely sure what they were looking at yet. Around 8 o'clock, Brenda stepped outside carrying her usual travel mug. She looked toward the trench, then at the permit posted clearly near the work area as required by the city. I watched her expression shift from curiosity to confusion. She crossed the street without hurrying, stopping several feet away from the temporary safety barriers. "What exactly are you building?" she asked. I smiled politely. "A permitted improvement on my property." She looked toward the crew assembling the reinforcing steel. "That seems awfully close to the property line." I nodded. The survey established the property line very precisely. She frowned. "Surely someone from the city approved this." I pointed toward the permit displayed beside the plans. "They already did." For the first time since this situation began, Brenda did not have an immediate response. She simply looked from the permit to the survey stakes and back again before walking home without another word. Less than an hour later, the city inspector arrived exactly as scheduled. He reviewed the excavation depth, reinforcement placement, setbacks, and form alignment before signing the inspection record with a quick signature that took less than 10 seconds but represented weeks of preparation. Once he drove away, I picked up my phone and called the ready-mix plant. 25 minutes later, the familiar rumble echoed through the neighborhood as the concrete truck rounded the corner. Anyone who has worked construction knows that sound carries a certain weight. It signals the moment when planning becomes permanent. The rotating drum slowed as the truck backed carefully into position. The smell of fresh cement filled the morning air while the pump operator unfolded the boom with practiced precision. Gray concrete flowed smoothly through the hose into the waiting forms, surrounding every reinforcing bar exactly as designed. My crew vibrated the mix, checked elevations, and screed the surface until every section matched the engineered specifications. Nobody rushed because rushing creates mistakes that last for decades. By lunchtime, the structure had begun taking shape with clean, straight lines rising confidently from the foundation. The wall was not unusually tall. It was not decorative. It simply occupied the exact space approved by the plans and protected by the recorded property boundary. Brenda returned outside just as the forms for the final section were secured. She walked halfway across her driveway before stopping abruptly. I watched her eyes follow the new wall toward the side of her garage. Then she looked at the remaining distance between the completed structure and her driveway opening. Her confident smile disappeared completely. She paced slowly from one side of her driveway to the other, as though searching for an angle she had somehow overlooked. There was none. She hurried back inside and returned moments later carrying a copy of what appeared to be her own property survey, comparing it nervously against what now stood only a few feet away. I continued checking concrete finish elevations without saying a word. Every trowel pass, every expansion joint, every measured edge reminded me of something my father often repeated. Good construction never argues with anyone. It simply exists exactly where the measurements say it belongs. As the afternoon sun reflected off the slowly curing concrete, the neighborhood finally began to understand what I had recognized days earlier. The narrow strip of land everyone had ignored for years had quietly become the most important piece of property on the entire block, and the permanent structure now standing upon it had been placed there one perfectly measured inch at a time. The concrete had barely reached its initial cure when the first official vehicle pulled into the neighborhood. It was not a surprise. I had expected questions the moment people realized the wall was permanent. A city inspector stepped out with a clipboard, nodded politely, and asked to review the completed work against the approved permit. My crew had already cleaned the site, stacked the remaining materials, and removed unnecessary equipment. Every inspection point was easy to access because we had followed the plans exactly. He checked the foundation dimensions, measured the setback from the recorded property line, confirmed reinforcement documentation, and compared the finished wall with the approved drawings. After nearly half an hour, he signed the final inspection form, handed me a copy, and wished me a good afternoon before driving away. I noticed several neighbors watching from their driveways. They had expected the inspector to order the wall removed. Instead, he left with everything approved. 10 minutes later, Brenda came outside carrying her phone, speaking rapidly as she paced back and forth near the entrance to her driveway. Within another hour, 2 members of the Homeowners Association board arrived. They stood beside the fence she had installed days earlier while she pointed repeatedly toward my wall. Even from across the street, I could tell she was explaining how unfair everything looked. One board member eventually walked over and asked whether he could see the permit. I handed him the approved documents, the sealed survey, and the inspection record without saying anything else. He spent several minutes reading before quietly returning the folder. His expression looked very different from the confident smile he wore earlier that week. He thanked me and walked back toward Brenda. Their conversation became noticeably shorter than the first one. By the following morning, another vehicle appeared, this time belonging to an attorney representing the association's insurance carrier. He introduced himself professionally, requested copies of the survey and permit, and asked several careful questions about the construction timeline. I answered every question honestly and provided copies of the public documents he requested. He never criticized the wall. He never suggested it violated any regulation. Instead, he thanked me for maintaining detailed records and left after less than 45 minutes. Late that afternoon, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving repeatedly next door. Brenda had backed her sport utility vehicle toward the garage entrance several times before stopping again. From where I stood, the problem was obvious. The legal clearance remaining between the new wall and the existing approach no longer provided practical vehicle access into the garage. Nothing had crossed onto her property. Nothing had extended beyond the approved line. The geometry simply reflected measurements that had always existed but had never mattered until she chose to install her own fence across my driveway. She stood silently for several moments before returning inside. The next day, I received a certified letter from the association requesting an emergency meeting. My attorney attended with me. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt very different from previous meetings I had attended over the years. Instead of discussing landscaping or holiday decorations, everyone focused on surveys, recorded deeds, permits, and engineering drawings spread across the conference table. The association's attorney spoke first. After reviewing the county records, the completed survey, and the city's inspection file, he explained that the recorded property boundaries controlled ownership regardless of mistaken assumptions made during internal discussions. He also confirmed that approved improvements constructed entirely within private property and compliant with local regulations generally could not be challenged simply because they created inconvenience. The room became remarkably quiet. Finally, another board member asked the question everyone had avoided since the beginning. How did this happen? My attorney answered calmly. He explained that no one had verified the recorded boundary before authorizing installation of the fence across my driveway. The association had relied on an informal interpretation instead of a licensed survey. That decision created the entire chain of events. Brenda stared down at the documents without speaking. For the first time since I had returned home, there was no confidence left in her voice because paperwork does not respond to confidence. It responds to facts. Before the meeting ended, the board voted to remove every violation notice issued against my property. They also agreed that the fence blocking my driveway had been installed without sufficient legal support and would need to be removed at the association's expense after coordinating with the appropriate contractors. Outside the clubhouse, several neighbors quietly approached me one at a time. Some apologized for believing the rumors. Others admitted they had assumed the association must have known the property lines better than the homeowner. I told every one of them the same thing. None of this had been about winning an argument. It had been about respecting records, measurements, and the rule that private property cannot be redefined simply because someone speaks with confidence. As I drove home beneath the warm evening sky, I passed the same wall that had become the center of the neighborhood's attention. It had never raised its voice, never attended a meeting, and never argued with anyone. It simply stood exactly where the law, the survey, the permit, and the measurements said it belonged. I watched the association's contractors remove the steel fence exactly 12 days after it had appeared. The same posts that had looked so permanent were lifted from the ground one by one with careful equipment, leaving behind fresh holes that were soon filled and compacted until my driveway looked almost exactly as it had before I left on that work trip. The difference was that nothing about the neighborhood felt the same anymore. People who had once accepted confident opinions without question now paused before believing rumors. They asked to see documents instead of listening to speculation. It was a small change, but I think communities become stronger through small changes repeated often enough. My driveway was open again, and for the first time in weeks I backed my truck into the garage without stopping halfway through the maneuver. The familiar sound of the tires rolling across the old concrete made me smile. I shut off the engine, stepped out, and rested one hand against the workbench my father had built. The afternoon sunlight reached through the garage door exactly the way it always had, illuminating the faded pencil marks on the wood that neither time nor years of hard work had erased. I realized then that I had never really been fighting over a driveway. I had been protecting a promise my father made when he built this place with his own hands. He believed that if you respected your work, your word, and the law, those things would protect you when life became difficult. Standing there surrounded by tools that had served our family for decades, I finally understood how right he had been. A week later, the Homeowners Association held another meeting. This one felt different from every meeting before it. The board announced new procedures requiring licensed surveys before any future decisions involving property boundaries or permanent improvements. They also adopted a policy requiring independent legal review before approving actions that could affect private property rights. Several homeowners thanked the board for making those changes. Others quietly admitted they wished those rules had existed much earlier. Brenda attended the meeting, but she remained unusually quiet. She no longer interrupted people or spoke with the certainty that had once filled every conversation. When the meeting ended, she approached me near the parking lot. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked toward the neighborhood entrance and said, "I should have verified the records before assuming I was right." It was not a dramatic apology. It was not emotional. It was simply honest, and sometimes honest is enough. I nodded and replied, "Measurements have a way of humbling all of us." She gave a small smile before walking away. That was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. Over the following months, life gradually returned to normal. My company stayed busy with commercial projects across the county. Children rode their bicycles through the neighborhood again without stopping to stare at construction equipment. Neighbors waved more often than they whispered. The wall remained exactly where it had been approved, standing quietly along the property line with clean edges and smooth concrete that slowly weathered into the same soft gray color as every other well-built structure. Some visitors asked why it had been built there. I usually smiled and answered with a simple explanation about respecting recorded boundaries and following the law. The full story was never really about revenge. It was about patience. It was about choosing documentation instead of anger, preparation instead of impulse, and lawful action instead of loud arguments. Looking back now, I think the most important lesson had nothing to do with concrete at all. Concrete hardens within hours, but trust takes years to build and only moments to damage. Authority deserves respect only when it respects the limits placed upon it. Ownership carries responsibilities as well as rights. And every homeowner should understand the documents they signed long before they ever need them. I still keep the sealed survey, the permits, the inspection records, and every letter from the association inside the same fireproof safe where my father stored the original deed decades ago. Not because I expect another dispute, but because those papers remind me that facts outlast opinions. Every now and then I stand at the end of my driveway, just before sunrise with a cup of coffee, listening to birds replace the silence that greeted me the morning I came home. The air smells like fresh grass instead of curing concrete now, and the neighborhood feels peaceful again. My truck rolls into the garage without obstruction. The workbench still waits exactly where it always has. The wall still stands exactly where every licensed survey, every approved permit, every inspection, and every recorded measurement said it belonged. And every time I pass it, I remember something my father taught me long before I ever learned how to finish concrete. Property lines do not care about confidence. They do not change because someone speaks louder, holds a title, or gathers a crowd. They remain exactly where the truth says they are. In the end, justice was never the loudest voice on the street. It was measured carefully, documented completely, built patiently, and poured one perfectly legal inch at a time.